The sound of a dozen revolvers cocking at once filled the Twin Falls saloon as Lillian Patterson slammed the door behind her, her fiery red hair billowing like flames around her face. The entire room fell silent, save for the piano player who hit one final sour note before his hands froze above the keys. She had only asked a simple question, where she might find the man who'd stolen her father's cattle. Yet, as always, her crimson locks and sharp tongue had earned her that familiar, unwanted title before she'd even finished speaking. "Trouble," someone whispered, loud enough for all to hear. "That's what they call her." Weston Hayes leaned against the bar, whiskey glass suspended halfway to his lips, watching the scene unfold with undisguised interest. His trail-worn hat cast a shadow over his eyes, but nothing could hide the slow smile spreading across his dust-covered face. "Good," he said, setting down his drink with deliberate care. "I like a little fire." It was 1878, and Twin Falls, Idaho was still finding its footing as more than just a stopping point along the Oregon Trail. The town had grown from a mere trading post to a proper settlement with a main street lined with wooden buildings, false fronts reaching toward the sky in imitation of grander cities back east. The Snake River rushed nearby, providing life to the otherwise unforgiving landscape. Lillian had traveled 3 days to reach this place, her dress coated in dust, her temper as hot as the summer sun beating down on the plains. Her father's cattle ranch outside of Boise had suffered its third raid in as many months, and this time she'd found tracks leading toward Twin Falls. Rumors spoke of a gang operating in the area, rustling cattle and selling them to the highest bidder. With her father bedridden from a fall, the responsibility had fallen to her. "I asked a simple question," Lillian said, her voice carrying through the still air of the saloon. "But I see Twin Falls hospitality leaves much to be desired." She adjusted her riding gloves, stained with the dust of hard travel. At 22, she had learned that a woman alone had to carry herself with twice the confidence of any man. "We don't take kindly to strangers making accusations, miss," a heavy-set man with a deputy's badge said, rising from his chair. "Especially not ones who burst in looking like they're fixing to start a fire with that hair of theirs." Laughter rippled through the saloon, though it died quickly when Lillian's green eyes flashed dangerously. Weston pushed himself away from the bar, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. At 28, he'd seen his share of trouble across the Western Territories. 6 years as a ranch hand, another 4 as a scout for the Army, and the last 2 as a hired gun for the cattle associations had taught him to recognize trouble and opportunity when he saw it. "Deputy Miller," Weston said, "seems to me the lady just asked a question." His voice was calm but carried an edge, like a knife wrapped in velvet. "Someone's been rustling cattle up Boise Way, and tracks led here. Seems like something the law might want to look into, not laugh about." The deputy's face reddened. "Hayes, you're not exactly welcome to speak on matters of law here, considering your history." "My history is keeping the peace when the law can't," Weston replied, his hand resting casually near his holstered Colt. "Or won't." Lillian looked between the 2 men, quickly assessing the tension. The cowboy Hayes stood differently from the others. His stance spoke of a man who'd seen conflict but didn't seek it. The deputy, however, seemed all too eager to assert his authority. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," Lillian said, though her tone suggested she was perfectly willing to if necessary. "My family's livelihood is at stake. 20 head of prime Hereford cattle disappeared 3 nights ago. The tracks led here, and I mean to find them." "Well, you won't find them by bursting in and disturbing honest folks at their drinking," Deputy Miller said. "Why don't you head on back to Boise? Tell your pa to hire proper hands to watch his herds." "My father hired 3 new hands last month," Lillian replied coldly. "They were found tied to fence posts, beaten half to death. So you'll excuse me if I decided to handle this matter personally." Weston's interest visibly sharpened. Cattle rustling was common enough, but this level of violence spoke of organization, and that meant good money behind it. The kind of money that could buy a deputy's blind eye. "Miss," Weston said, tipping his hat slightly, "might I suggest we continue this conversation somewhere less inhospitable? I know a thing or two about tracking stolen cattle." He glanced meaningfully at the deputy. "And about who might be inclined to look the other way." Deputy Miller's hand moved toward his gun. "You making accusations, Hayes?" "Just offering my services to the lady," Weston replied. "Professional courtesy, nothing more." Lillian studied the cowboy. Tall, lean, with shoulders broadened by years of hard work. His eyes were steady beneath the brim of his hat, and though his clothing was trail-worn, his gun belt was well maintained. A man who took care of his tools was a man who knew their value. "I'd welcome the conversation, Mr. Hayes," she said finally. "I've ridden a long way, and it seems information here comes at a premium." Weston nodded toward the door. "There's a cafe down the street. Makes a decent cup of coffee if you're partial." Lillian moved toward the exit, aware of the eyes following her. As they reached the door, Deputy Miller called out, "Hayes, you're making a mistake throwing in with trouble like her. Some fires burn those who play with them." Weston paused, hand on the door frame. "Some fires keep you warm when the cold night comes, Deputy. I'll take my chances." Outside, the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Twin Falls Main Street. Horses stood hitched to posts, swatting flies with their tails while wagons rumbled past, kicking up dust. Lillian blinked against the brightness, then turned to face her unexpected ally. "You didn't need to involve yourself, Mr. Hayes. I'm quite capable of handling my affairs." "Never doubted it for a moment, Miss Patterson. Lillian Patterson, Weston Hayes." He offered a slight bow. "And I didn't step in for your sake, Miss Patterson. I've been tracking those rustlers myself for the past 2 weeks. Your arrival just confirmed what I already suspected." Lillian raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "That whoever's behind this isn't just some ragtag band of opportunists. They're organized, they're violent, and they've got protection." He nodded back toward the saloon. "The kind that wears a badge." They began walking toward the small cafe at the end of the street, maintaining a respectable distance between them as propriety demanded. Even in frontier towns, appearances mattered. "Who hired you, Mr. Hayes?" Lillian asked directly. "Cattlemen's Association out of Pocatello. They've lost close to 100 head in the past 3 months. When I followed the trail here, I found myself about as welcome as a skunk at a picnic." "That makes 2 of us," Lillian said with the ghost of a smile. "Though I suspect my reception had more to do with this." She touched her vivid red hair, which gleamed like copper in the sunlight. Weston's eyes followed the gesture, a flicker of appreciation visible before his expression returned to professional neutrality. Red hair's considered bad luck by some in these parts, superstitious nonsense. "And what do you think, Mr. Hayes?" He held the cafe door open for her. "I think cattle thieves are the bad luck around here, Miss Patterson, and I aim to change their fortune." The cafe was a simple establishment with half a dozen tables covered in checkered cloth. A heavy-set woman moved between them, coffee pot in hand. She nodded at Weston but eyed Lillian with open curiosity. They settled at a corner table where they could watch both the door and the street through the window. The waitress approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "Coffee, Mr. Hayes. And for your friend." Her emphasis suggested speculation about their relationship. "2 coffees, Mrs. Whitley. "And whatever you've got warm from the kitchen," Weston replied. When she departed, Lillian leaned forward. "Tell me what you know," she said quietly. "My father's not just losing cattle. Last month we found our best breeding bull slaughtered. Just killed and left to rot. That's not the work of ordinary rustlers." Weston's expression darkened. "No, it's not. It's a message. Someone wants your father's land, Miss Patterson. The ranch has been in our family since before Idaho was a territory. We survived the wars, the droughts, even the mining disputes. We're not about to be run off now. Admirable, but whoever's behind this has deep pockets and a mean streak. The pattern I've seen suggests they're clearing a path. Taking out the smaller ranches first, then moving on to the established ones. Your father's place must be next on their list." Mrs. Whitley returned with 2 steaming mugs of coffee and a plate of fresh biscuits. Lillian waited until she was out of earshot before continuing. "Who would have that kind of influence? And why?" "Railroads coming through," Weston said, adding a spoonful of sugar to his coffee. "Northern Pacific is planning a spur line from the main track. Whoever controls the land where that track goes stands to make a fortune." "But the railroad survey teams haven't even come through yet," Lillian protested. "How would anyone know where to buy?" "Someone always knows ahead of time, Miss Patterson. Information is worth more than gold out here." He sipped his coffee. "My guess is someone in Twin Falls got a tip about the route and is clearing the way for when the official announcements come." Lillian considered this, stirring her coffee absently. Her green eyes, startling against her pale skin and red hair, narrowed in thought. "My father mentioned a man came by last month. Offered to buy our water rights for a ridiculous sum. Calloway was his name. Said he represented Eastern investors." Weston straightened slightly. "Calloway, tall fellow, fancy clothes, walks with a silver-headed cane. That's him. Do you know him?" "I know of him. Horace Calloway. He's been buying up land and rights all across southern Idaho for the past year. Always claims he represents investors, but no one ever sees them." Weston's voice lowered. "And those who refuse to sell tend to run into difficulties. Like rustled cattle and murdered bulls," Lillian said grimly. "And hired hands beaten half to death," Weston added. "Did your father refuse his offer?" "Quite colorfully, as I recall." A small smile touched Lillian's lips. "Pa told him those water rights would leave our family's hands when the Snake River runs dry." Weston's expression grew serious. "Then we need to move fast. If Calloway's behind this, and I'd bet my last dollar he won't stop at cattle. Once he decides to take something, he takes it completely." "What are you suggesting, Mr. Hayes?" "I'm suggesting we combine our efforts, Miss Patterson. You know your father's land and the cattle that were taken. I know how these rustlers operate and where they might be holding stolen herds." He leaned forward. "Together, we might not only recover your father's cattle but put an end to Calloway's operation." Lillian studied him, weighing his proposal against her own misgivings about trusting a stranger. Finally, she nodded. "Very well, Mr. Hayes. But understand this, I won't be relegated to camp cook while you do the tracking. I've been riding fence lines and branding cattle since I was tall enough to reach a stirrup." A slow smile spread across Weston's face. "I wouldn't dream of it, Miss Patterson. Something tells me you're handier in a tight spot than most men I've ridden with." "You have no idea," she replied, matching his smile with one of her own. "When do we start?" "Dawn tomorrow. We'll need supplies for several days. I've been tracking patterns of cattle movement through local sales. There's an abandoned mining camp in the hills east of here. My guess is they're holding the cattle there until they can move them to the railhead at Pocatello." Lillian nodded. "I'll need to send a telegram to my father, let him know I'm extending my stay." "Best not to say too much in that telegram," Weston cautioned. If Calloway has bought the deputy, he's likely got eyes on the telegraph office too. I'm not new to caution, Mr. Hayes, Lillian replied dryly. I'll simply inform my father that I'm pursuing a promising lead. As they finished their coffee, Weston outlined what they would need for the journey. The mining camp was at least 2 days' ride into rough country, and if his suspicions were correct, they would find not just cattle but armed men guarding them. We'll need to approach carefully, he explained. Scout the location, determine how many men they have, and plan accordingly. And if it's too many, Lillian asked practically. Then we ride back to Pocatello, and I convince the Cattlemen's Association to hire more guns, Weston said. But between the two of us, I think we can manage reconnaissance without raising alarm. They departed the cafe as the afternoon began to wane, agreeing to meet at the livery stable at first light. As they walked down the boardwalk, Deputy Miller emerged from the saloon, watching them with undisguised suspicion. Remember, Weston said quietly, trust no one in Twin Falls, not until we know how deep Calloway's influence runs. Lillian nodded, her fiery hair catching the late afternoon sun. I trust my judgment, Mr. Hayes, and right now it's telling me you're the only ally I have in this town. Let's hope that's enough, Weston replied, tipping his hat before they parted ways. Because if Calloway is behind these rustlings, we're poking a mighty dangerous bear. Good, Lillian said with a fierce smile that matched her hair. I've never been one to walk softly around predators. They mistake it for weakness. As she headed toward the telegraph office, Weston watched her go, impressed by her determination despite the dangers ahead. In his years riding the territories, he'd met few men with her courage, let alone women willing to chase rustlers into the wilderness. There was something about Lillian Patterson that went beyond her striking appearance, a fire inside that matched the flame of her hair. And despite the peril they were surely riding toward, Weston Hayes found himself looking forward to dawn with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. The following morning arrived with the first pale streaks of light, barely visible on the eastern horizon. Weston was already at the livery stable when Lillian arrived, dressed in practical riding clothes that raised eyebrows even in a frontier town's split skirt, sturdy boots, and a man's shirt beneath a fitted jacket. Her red hair was braided and tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, though errant strands escaped to frame her face. "You're early," Weston observed, tightening the cinch on his saddle. His dun gelding stood patiently, already packed with supplies. "I've found it's best not to keep trouble waiting," Lillian replied, moving to where her own horse, a spirited bay mare, was stabled. "It tends to find me whether I'm prepared or not." Weston smiled slightly. "Did you manage to send your telegram?" "Yes, though the operator seemed unusually interested in its contents." She began saddling her horse with practiced efficiency. "I kept it vague, as you suggested, but I'm certain word of my message will reach the wrong ears before midday. All the more reason to be on our way." Weston handed her a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Extra ammunition for that revolver I'm guessing you carry somewhere about your person." Lillian raised an eyebrow but accepted the package. "You guess correctly, Mr. Hayes, though I'm equally proficient with a rifle." She patted the scabbard attached to her saddle. "Winchester?" he asked. "Model of '73. A gift from my father when I turned 18. A practical man, your father. He has 3 daughters and no sons," Lillian explained, checking her saddlebags. "He taught us all to shoot, ride, and run the ranch. Said women with brains were worth twice their weight in gold, but women with brains and skill were priceless." "A philosophy I find myself agreeing with," Weston replied. He led his horse out into the yard, where the livery owner was just emerging from his quarters, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Mighty early start, Hayes," the man observed, eyeing Lillian with open curiosity. "Long ride ahead," Weston answered vaguely. He passed the man a few coins. "Much obliged for the boarding." They rode out of Twin Falls as the town was just beginning to stir, taking the eastern trail that wound into the foothills. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Weston set a steady pace, one that would cover ground without exhausting their mounts. "You didn't ask where we're heading," Lillian observed after they'd put several miles between themselves and town. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready," Weston replied. "Though I'm guessing it's not the mining camp I mentioned yesterday." Lillian smiled appreciatively. "You're quicker than most, Mr. Hayes. No, I received information last night that suggests we should look elsewhere first. I'm listening." The telegraph operator wasn't the only one interested in my presence. I was approached at my boarding house by a young woman, a maid who works at the Twin Falls Hotel. She said her brother works as a stable hand at a ranch about 15 miles northeast of here, owned by a man named Lancaster. Charles Lancaster. Weston's interest sharpened. "He's rumored to be Calloway's right hand in these parts. The very same. According to this girl, her brother has seen cattle with Patterson brands being held in Lancaster's north pasture. They're being rebranded at night." Weston nodded slowly. "It makes sense. The mining camp would be for longer-term holding, but Lancaster's ranch would be a processing point, a place to change brands before moving them on." "Precisely my thought," Lillian agreed. "If we can catch them in the act of rebranding, we'd have the evidence needed to involve the territorial marshal, not just the local law." "It's risky," Weston warned. "Lancaster's place will be better guarded than the mining camp. And if Calloway's involved directly, there could be a small army of hired guns." Lillian's green eyes flashed with determination. "My father could lose everything, Mr. Hayes. 20 head might not sound like much to the Cattlemen's Association, but for us, it's the difference between survival and ruin. Those cattle represent our breeding stock, carefully selected over years." Weston studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Northeast it is, then. But we approach with caution. Lancaster's spread sits in a valley with clear sightlines. We'll need to come in from the high ground after dark." They rode steadily through the morning, following game trails that kept them away from the main roads. The landscape gradually changed from the flat river valley around Twin Falls to rolling hills dotted with pine and juniper. By midday, they stopped in a sheltered hollow to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch of jerky and hardtack. As they sat in the shade of a gnarled juniper, Weston studied the map he'd spread between them. "Lancaster's ranch is here," he said, pointing to a valley nestled between two ridgelines. "If your information is correct, the north pasture would be on this side, backed up against the foothills." Lillian leaned closer, her braid falling forward over her shoulder. "That gives us good approach through these draws," she noted, tracing a finger along the map. "We could reach the ridge by dusk, observe the operation, and decide how to proceed." "You've done this before," Weston observed. "Tracked rustlers?" "Yes, though not on this scale." Lillian sat back, breaking off a piece of jerky. 2 years ago, a group of drifters began picking off strays along our southern boundary. My father was away in Boise, so my sisters and I tracked them to their camp and persuaded them to return what they'd taken." "Persuaded?" Weston's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Cordelia, my middle sister, is an excellent shot. She can put a bullet through a playing card at 50 paces. Lillian smiled at the memory. "She put one through the seat of the ringleader's pants while he was standing, made quite an impression on his companions." Weston laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise even him. "I'm beginning to think the Patterson women are a force to be reckoned with." "You have no idea," Lillian replied, her smile warming. My youngest sister, Margaret, once knocked a man unconscious with a frying pan when he tried to steal horses from our stable. She was 14 at the time. And what's your particular talent, Miss Patterson? Weston asked, his eyes holding hers with unexpected intensity. Lillian held his gaze. I'm the one they send when diplomacy and frying pans fail, Mr. Hayes. I finish what others start. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits who understood the harsh realities of frontier justice. Weston nodded slowly, respect evident in his expression. Then I'm glad we're riding the same trail, he said simply. They packed up and continued their journey, the conversation shifting to practical matters of approach and observation. By late afternoon, they had reached the pine-covered ridge that overlooked Lancaster's valley. Leaving their horses secured in a hidden draw, they crawled to the ridgeline to survey the ranch below. Lancaster's operation was substantial, a large main house, several outbuildings, bunkhouses for hired hands, and extensive corrals. To the north, just as Lillian's informant had indicated, a separate pasture held cattle at least 30 head from what they could see at this distance. Weston passed Lillian his field glass. Take a look. Can you make out any brands from here? She adjusted the glass, focusing on the distant cattle. It's hard to tell for certain, but those two near the fence line, the brand looks wrong, blurred like it's been altered. She continued scanning. And that's definitely a Patterson P with something burned over it. They're being clever, Weston observed. Instead of completely rebranding, they're altering existing brands, harder to detect at quick glance, especially if they're moved quickly to market. There's activity by that small barn, Lillian said, shifting the glass. Men moving equipment. Looks like they're setting up for tonight's work. Weston took back the field glass, studying the scene. I count at least 8 men in sight, probably more inside or on the range. That's a lot of guns for a simple ranching operation. So what's our play? Lillian asked, her expression determined despite the odds. We need evidence that will stand up with the territorial marshal, Weston said thoughtfully. Witnessing the rebranding would be ideal, but getting close enough for that without being seen. He shook his head. Too risky with that many men. What about the cattle themselves, if we could get close enough to identify them conclusively as Patterson stock? That might work. Most ranchers keep records of specific markings beyond the brand, notches in ears, natural colorings, that sort of thing. Lillian nodded eagerly. We do. I have my father's breeding records memorized. If I could get a clear look at even a few of those cattle, I could identify them. After dark, then, Weston decided. We'll work our way down through that pine stand to the north fence line. Get you close enough to identify your stock, then withdraw and make for the territorial marshal's office in Pocatello. As the sun began to set, they retreated to their small camp in the draw, eating a cold supper to avoid the telltale sign of smoke. Darkness fell swiftly, bringing with it a chill that had them both pulling on extra layers. Ready? Weston asked as the last light faded from the sky, leaving only stars and a sliver of moon to illuminate the landscape. Lillian nodded, checking her revolver before securing it in its holster. Born ready, Mr. Hayes. They made their way carefully down the slope, using the pine trees for cover. The night was quiet except for the occasional call of an owl and the distant lowing of cattle. As they neared the valley floor, Weston held up a hand, signaling a stop. Rider, he whispered, pointing to their left. Sure enough, a mounted figure moved along the fence line, rifle visible across his saddle. They froze, pressed against the trunk of a massive pine, barely breathing until the guard passed. They've got the perimeter patrolled, Weston murmured. We'll need to time our approach between passes. They waited, watching as another rider appeared from the opposite direction. Once both had moved beyond sight, Weston and Lillian sprinted across the open ground to the fence line, dropping low beside a cluster of rocks. The cattle were just visible in the starlight, dark shapes moving slowly in the pasture. Lillian studied them intently, then began to crawl along the fence line for a closer look. Weston followed, constantly scanning for signs of the guards returning. "There," Lillian whispered excitedly, pointing to a large steer near the fence. "That's Hercules, one of our prize breeding stock. See the white mark on his forehead, like a star, and the notch in his left ear." Weston peered through the darkness. "I see it. Can you identify others?" Lillian continued her examination, moving further along the fence. "Yes, that's definitely our stock. They've tried to alter the brands, but poorly. And there, that heifer with the unusual pattern on her flank. That's Athena, born on our ranch 2 springs ago. How many can you positively identify?" Weston asked. "At least 7 so far, and I'm certain the others are ours too." "This is all the proof we need," Lillian said triumphantly. A sudden noise from the direction of the barn caught their attention. Lanterns flared to life, illuminating several men moving toward the pasture. "They're starting the night's work," Weston said urgently. "We need to go. Now." They began to retreat along the fence line, staying low. Just as they reached the point where they would need to cross open ground to the tree line, shouting erupted from the ranch. "Riders coming in fast from the east," someone yelled. "Looks like trouble." Lanterns and torches blazed across the ranch yard as men rushed to positions. Gunfire suddenly erupted, followed by the thundering of hooves as a group of riders charged into the ranch from the far side. "What the hell?" Weston muttered, pulling Lillian deeper into the shadows. "Could be a rival gang," Lillian suggested, watching the chaos unfold. "Or law enforcement." The firefight intensified with muzzle flashes illuminating the night. Taking advantage of the distraction, Weston tugged at Lillian's arm. "This is our chance. Everyone's focused on the attack. We can make it to the trees." They sprinted across the open ground, reaching the tree line just as riders from the ranch began pursuing the attackers, who were already retreating into the night. As gunfire continued to echo through the valley, Weston and Lillian climbed swiftly back up the ridge to their hidden campsite. "That was unexpected," Lillian said when they finally reached their horses, her breathing heavy from the climb. "But fortunate," Weston replied. "Whatever that was about, it's given us a clean escape. We should move out immediately, put some distance between us and Lancaster's men before dawn." They quickly packed their minimal camp and mounted up, using the starlight to navigate along the ridge before dropping down into the next valley. They rode steadily through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, they found a secluded spot in a rocky outcropping overlooking a small stream. Exhausted but triumphant, they finally allowed themselves to relax. "We did it," Lillian said, her face flushed with exertion and excitement. "We have the evidence we need. Once we reach the territorial marshal, Lancaster and Calloway won't stand a chance." "It's a good start," Weston agreed, though his expression remained cautious. "But reaching the marshal won't be simple. Calloway's influence is widespread. We'll need to avoid main roads and settlements until we reach Pocatello." "How far is that from here?" 3 days hard riding if we're careful." Weston unsaddled his horse, allowing the animal to drink from the stream. "And there's still the question of who those riders were last night. Rival rustlers, possibly, or it could be someone else with a grudge against Lancaster." Weston frowned. "Either way, it complicates things. There will be men scouring these hills once Lancaster realizes some of his fence riders are missing." "Then we shouldn't linger," Lillian said practically, despite her obvious fatigue. "We can rest for a few hours, then push on." Weston studied her with growing admiration. Most women, most men, for that matter, would be complaining after a night like they'd had. Yet here she was, ready to continue the mission without hesitation. "You're something else, Lillian Patterson," he said quietly. She looked up, surprised by his use of her first name. Something passed between them, a current of understanding that went beyond their shared purpose. "As are you, Weston Hayes," she replied softly. "Not many would risk themselves for a stranger's cattle." "It's not just about the cattle anymore," he admitted. "Calloway and his kind have been squeezing honest ranchers all across the territory. Someone needs to stand against them." Lillian smiled, the expression transforming her tired face. "Well then, it seems we're well matched in purpose." "Among other things," Weston said, holding her gaze for a moment longer than propriety might allow. "They set up a small camp, taking turns standing watch while the others slept. The day grew warm as the sun climbed higher, but their sheltered position beneath an overhanging rock kept them relatively comfortable. During her watch, Lillian found herself studying Weston as he slept. The hard lines of his face softened in repose, revealing a younger man than his weathered appearance suggested. She wondered about his story, what had led him to become a hired gun for the Cattlemen's Association. What experiences had shaped those watchful eyes and careful ways? When he awoke a few hours later, he caught her looking and raised an eyebrow in silent question. "Just wondering what makes a man choose this life," Lillian said honestly. "Always on the move, always in danger." Weston sat up, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "Could ask the same of you," he countered. "Most women would be content to let men handle rustlers and range wars." "I'm not most women," Lillian replied with a shrug. "Never have been." "No," Weston agreed with a small smile. "You certainly are not." He reached for his canteen, taking a long drink before continuing. "As for me, didn't have much choice, really. Lost my parents young, raised by an uncle who ran a freight business out of Missouri. Learned to shoot protecting wagons from road agents. When the war came, I was just old enough to fight." A shadow crossed his face. "Saw enough killing to last several lifetimes. After that, drifted west like so many others." "Looking for a fresh start," Lillian guessed. "Looking for something that made sense," Weston corrected. "Found it working cattle. There's an honesty to it. You work hard, the herd thrives. Simple," he sighed. "Or it should be. But then men like Calloway come along thinking they can take what others have built with nothing but money and threats." "So you fight for those who can't fight for themselves," Lillian said, understanding dawning. Weston looked uncomfortable with her assessment. "I fight for what's right," he said simply. "Or try to. Don't always succeed." Lillian found herself moved by his unassuming honesty. Here was a man who had seen the worst humanity had to offer yet still chose to stand for something. It was rare, especially in territories where law was often whatever the strongest enforced. "Your turn," Weston said, changing the subject. "Why is Lillian Patterson chasing cattle rustlers instead of hosting tea parties, or whatever it is proper young ladies are supposed to do?" Lillian laughed. "Can you imagine me at a tea party? I'd likely scandalize everyone present within the first 5 minutes." "Without doubt," Weston agreed with a grin, "but that doesn't answer my question." Lillian's smile faded as she considered her response. "My mother died when I was 12, she finally said. "Fever took her one winter. Left my father with 3 daughters and a ranch to run in a territory where most believed women were fit only for cooking and childbearing." "Your father thought differently," Weston observed. "He did. He taught us everything he would have taught sons: how to ride, rope, shoot, track, manage cattle, negotiate prices." Pride colored her voice. Said the land didn't care if hands that worked it belonged to men or women, only that they were willing to work hard. Wise man. He is. And now he's ill, possibly dying, while men like Calloway try to steal what he spent his life building. Fierceness flashed in her green eyes. I won't allow it, not while I draw breath. Weston nodded slowly, understanding and respect evident in his expression. Then we'd best make sure those cattle get back where they belong, he said. And that Calloway learned stealing from the Pattersons carries consequences. They rested through the hottest part of the day before breaking camp and continuing their journey. Weston led them on a circuitous route that avoided the main trails, following stream beds and game paths that would leave minimal tracks. As dusk approached on the second day of their journey, they crested a ridge and spotted a small settlement in the valley below, little more than a trading post, a livery, and a handful of buildings clustered around a crossroads. Elk Ridge, Weston identified it. Small enough that news might not have reached here yet about Lancaster's troubles. Could we risk stopping? Lillian asked. Their supplies were running low, and both their horses could use proper feed after the hard traveling. Weston considered the settlement thoughtfully. Might be necessary. We've got another full day's ride to Pocatello, and we're short on essentials. He glanced at Lillian. But you'll need to keep that hat pulled low. Your hair tends to be memorable, Lillian smirked. So I've been told. They approached the settlement cautiously as full darkness fell. The trading post was still lit, a lantern burning in its window. A few horses were hitched outside what appeared to be a small saloon from which piano music drifted faintly. I'll see about supplies, Weston said as they dismounted at the edge of town. You stay with the horses, try not to be noticed, and miss all the fun, Lillian countered. We'll both go. I'm less likely to draw attention if I'm with you than standing alone with two horses in the shadows. Weston couldn't argue with her logic. They secured their horses at the livery, paying extra for good feed and a rub-down, then made their way to the trading post. Inside, an elderly man dozed behind the counter, waking with a start at the jingle of the doorbell. Evening, the man greeted them, adjusting his spectacles. Don't get many visitors this time of night. Just passing through, Weston replied casually. Need some supplies for the trail, coffee, jerky, hardtack if you have it. While Weston handled the purchases, Lillian browsed the small store, keeping her hat low but ears open. Two other customers were present, a bearded man examining ammunition and a young cowhand looking at tobacco. Heard there was trouble over at Lancaster's place, the bearded man was saying. Riders came through this morning, said there was a raid 2 nights back. Several men killed. Lillian's pulse quickened, though she kept her expression neutral as she pretended to examine a display of canned goods. Lancaster's got enemies aplenty, the cowhand replied. Word is he's been working for that eastern feller Calloway, running small ranchers off their land. Well, someone took exception, the bearded man said. They're saying it might have been the Patterson outfit from up Boy's Way. Heard their stock was among what Lancaster was holding. Lillian stiffened, fighting the urge to turn around. They thought her father was behind the raid, Patterson's. The cowhand sounded skeptical. Ain't the old man laid up? Heard he took a bad fall months back. Got daughters though, don't he? One of 'em's supposed to be a real firebrand. Red hair, they call her Trouble. The men chuckled, unaware that the subject of their gossip stood mere feet away, her hand now gripping a can of peaches so tightly her knuckles had whitened. Well, whoever hit Lancaster's place, the storekeeper interjected, they stirred up a hornet's nest. Calloway's offering $500 for information about anyone involved, had riders through here yesterday posting notices. Weston, who had been listening while concluding his purchases, casually joined the conversation. 500's a lot of money. Must have been some raid. Took nearly 40 head of prime cattle, the storekeeper said, and killed 4 of Lancaster's men, including his foreman. He leaned forward conspiratorially. Between us, Lancaster's been rebranding stolen stock for months. Maybe this was just chickens coming home to roost. Weston nodded thoughtfully. Maybe so. Appreciate the warning about those riders, though. Roads sound unsafe. He collected his purchases, signaling Lillian with a slight nod toward the door. They departed casually, making their way back to the livery to collect their horses. "We need to move," Weston said urgently once they were alone. "If Calloway's men are watching the settlements." "They think my father organized that raid," Lillian said, her voice tight with worry. "What if they go after him in retaliation?" "All the more reason to reach the marshal quickly," Weston replied, helping her mount. "Once we have official law involved, your father will have protection." They rode out of Elk Ridge under cover of darkness, pushing their horses harder than before. The news had added urgency to their mission. Not only was Calloway trying to steal Patterson cattle, but he might now be planning direct action against the family. They rode through the night, stopping only when their mounts needed rest. As dawn broke, they found themselves in increasingly settled country, with small farms and homesteads dotting the landscape. Pocatello was still a day's ride away, but the increasing signs of civilization brought both hope and risk. More people meant more eyes that might recognize them or report their presence. By midday, exhaustion was taking its toll. They'd been riding hard for nearly 2 days with minimal rest. Even Lillian, with all her determination, was swaying slightly in the saddle. "We need to stop," Weston finally declared, guiding them toward a small stream sheltered by cottonwoods. "A few hours' rest or we'll both fall from our horses." They dismounted in a sheltered hollow, the horses gratefully drinking from the clear stream. Lillian sank to the ground, leaning back against a tree trunk, her face pale with fatigue. "Just a short rest," she insisted, though her eyes were already closing. "We can't afford to lose time." "No use reaching Pocatello if we're too exhausted to state our case," Weston countered, unpacking some of their supplies. He handed her jerky and hardtack, which she accepted mechanically. "Eat, then sleep. I'll keep watch." Too tired to argue, Lillian complied. After eating, she lay down on her bedroll, asleep almost instantly. Weston watched her for a moment, struck by how young she looked in repose, the fierce determination that animated her features softened by sleep. He settled himself against a tree with a clear view of their surroundings, rifle across his lap. Despite his own exhaustion, he remained vigilant, knowing that they were now in dangerous territory, caught between reaching safety and being discovered by Calloway's men. The afternoon lengthened into early evening. Weston had allowed himself to doze briefly, confident that the horses would alert him to any approach. He woke fully at the sound of Lillian stirring. "How long did I sleep?" she asked, sitting up and pushing her hair back beneath her hat. "About 4 hours," Weston replied. "Needed it by the look of you." "Such flattery, Mr. Hayes," Lillian said dryly, though a smile touched her lips. "Your turn now. I'll keep watch while you rest." Weston hesitated, but the weight of his own fatigue won out. He settled on his bedroll, tipping his hat over his eyes. "Wake me in 2 hours. We'll ride through the night, reach Pocatello by dawn." He was asleep within minutes. Lillian moved to take his position against the tree, rifle ready. The evening was peaceful, with only the sounds of birds and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. She used the quiet time to consider their next steps. Once they reached the territorial marshal, they would need to present their evidence clearly and convincingly. Calloway would certainly have influential friends who would try to discredit their claims, As darkness fell, the peace was shattered by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Lillian tensed, raising the rifle as she scanned the darkening landscape. The sounds grew closer, multiple horses moving at a steady pace along what must be a nearby trail. She moved swiftly to Weston's side, placing a hand on his shoulder. He woke instantly, fully alert with the instincts of a man accustomed to danger. "Riders," Lillian whispered. "Coming this way." Weston nodded, rising silently and moving to the edge of their small hollow. The hoofbeats were clearer now, accompanied by the jingle of tack and the low murmur of voices. "At least 4, maybe 6, he assessed quietly, moving along the main trail. "Calloway's men?" Lillian asked, crouching beside him. "Possibly, or regular travelers." Weston frowned. "Either way, we should stay hidden until they pass." They withdrew deeper into the hollow, quieting the horses with gentle hands. The riders came closer, their voices occasionally carrying on the still evening air. "Checked every settlement between here and Twin Falls," one voice said. "No sign of them." "They're heading for Pocatello," another replied. "Calloway's sure of it." Lillian and Weston exchanged glances. These were definitely Calloway's men, and they were looking specifically for them. "What I don't understand," a third voice added, "is why Calloway's so fired up about these two. It's not like they're the ones who hit Lancaster's place." "Don't matter," the first voice answered. "Calloway says they saw something they shouldn't have. And the woman's a Patterson. After what happened at the ranch, he wants all Pattersons accounted for." The riders passed by their hiding place without stopping, their conversation fading as they continued down the trail. Lillian released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "They know we're heading to Pocatello," she whispered, "and they're looking specifically for us." "Changes our plans," Weston said grimly. "They'll have men watching all approaches to town. We need another route." "Or another destination," Lillian suggested. "The territorial circuit judge visits Blackfoot. It's east of here, maybe an extra half-day's ride. If we can reach him, he has the authority to issue warrants even without the marshal." Weston considered this. "It's risky. Calloway might have men there too, but it's less obvious than Pocatello." He nodded decisively. "Blackfoot it is. We'll need to alter course, stay away from main trails entirely." They quickly broke camp, packing their few belongings and mounting up. Instead of returning to the trail, they rode across country, using the stars for navigation. The going was slower on the uneven terrain, but they were less likely to encounter Calloway's searching parties. They rode through the night, speaking little, each lost in their own thoughts. For Lillian, worry for her father and sisters mingled with a growing awareness of her companion. Weston Hayes had proven himself not just capable but honorable, a rare combination in her experience. He could have abandoned their mission at any point, especially now that it had become personally dangerous, yet he rode beside her without complaint. As dawn approached, they crested a low rise and paused to rest the horses. In the distance, the first buildings of Blackfoot were just visible, pale shapes against the lightening sky. "We made it," Lillian said, relief evident in her voice. "Not quite yet," Weston cautioned. "We still need to reach the judge without being spotted by Calloway's men." "Judge Harmon keeps quarters above the land office," Lillian said. "My father appeared before him once in a water rights dispute. He's known to be fair if strict." "We'll need to enter town separately," Weston decided. "Less conspicuous that way." "I'll go first, check for any sign of Calloway's men. You follow 15 minutes later." Lillian nodded, though she disliked the idea of separating. "Where will we meet?" "The land office, if it seems safe. If not, there's a small church at the edge of town. We can meet behind it." They finalized their plan as they approached the outskirts of Blackfoot. The town was just waking up, smoke rising from chimneys as businesses prepared to open for the day. "Be careful," Lillian said as Weston prepared to ride ahead. "Calloway's men will know your face too." "Been keeping this face out of trouble for years," he replied with a slight smile. "It's that fiery hair of yours we need to worry about. Keep it covered." Lillian touched the brim of her hat, ensuring it shadowed her features. 15 minutes, she confirmed. Weston rode into town at an unhurried pace, the picture of a traveler arriving after a long journey. Lillian watched until he disappeared among the buildings, then dismounted to wait, counting the minutes anxiously. When 15 minutes had passed, she remounted and followed his path into Blackfoot. The town was more active now, with shopkeepers opening their establishments and a few wagons moving along the main street. Lillian kept her head down, just another traveler passing through. She located the land office without difficulty, a 2-story building with official notices posted outside. There was no sign of Weston, which could mean either that he'd found it unsafe or that he was waiting inside. Uncertain, Lillian continued past, heading toward the small church at the edge of town that they designated as their alternate meeting place. As she approached the church, a sense of unease grew. The building appeared deserted, with no one visible in the yard or the small cemetery behind it. She dismounted cautiously, leading her horse behind the structure where they would be hidden from the street. "Weston," she called softly, scanning the area. No response came. Lillian secured her horse to a post and drew her revolver, moving carefully around the perimeter of the church. Nothing seemed amiss, yet her instincts were screaming warnings. A sound from inside the church caught her attention, a thud, as if something heavy had fallen. Lillian approached the back door cautiously, gun ready. It was slightly ajar. She pushed it open with her foot, wincing at the creak of hinges. "Weston," she called again, stepping into the dim interior. The scene inside froze her in place. Weston was there, on his knees, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. Behind him stood 2 men, one holding a gun to his head. And seated in the front pew, calmly removing his gloves, was a tall, elegantly dressed man whom Lillian instantly recognized from her father's description, Horace Calloway. "Miss Patterson," Calloway greeted her, his voice cultured and pleasant. "How kind of you to join us. Please do put away that gun. My associates are rather nervous around armed women." "I'll take my chances," Lillian replied coldly, keeping her revolver steady despite the terror gripping her heart. "Release him." Now, Calloway smiled, the expression never reaching his cold eyes. "I'm afraid I can't do that. Mr. Hayes and I were just discussing his unfortunate choice of traveling companions." He stood, leaning on a silver-headed cane. "You see, I have significant investments in this territory, Miss Patterson, investments that require cooperation from local landowners." "You mean theft and intimidation," Lillian retorted. "We know about Lancaster's operation. We've seen our cattle being rebranded. The judge will hear of this." "Judge Harmon left for Boise yesterday," Calloway informed her smoothly. "Most unfortunate timing, and as for your cattle, well, possession is rather important in these territories, isn't it?" Weston struggled against his captors, earning a brutal blow to the back of his head that sent him sprawling to the floor. "Stop!" Lillian cried, taking a step forward before the second man trained his gun on her, forcing her to halt. "Your father refused a very generous offer, Miss Patterson," Calloway continued, circling Weston's prone form. "I offered to buy his water rights for twice their value, yet he persisted in his. Rustic sentimentality about family legacy," he sighed, as if genuinely regretful. "Now I'm forced to take more direct measures." "My father will never sell to you," Lillian declared, her mind racing for a way out of this deadly situation. Not even if you kill me." "Oh, I don't intend to kill you, my dear," Calloway replied with a chilling smile. "That would be both messy and unnecessary. No, you and Mr. Hayes will simply disappear, perhaps a tragic accident while traveling. And when your father learns of this tragedy, coming so soon after the loss of his prized cattle, well, I suspect his resistance will crumble." On the floor, Weston was regaining consciousness, his eyes finding Lillian's with a message she understood instantly. "Be ready." "You're forgetting something, Calloway," Weston said, his voice rough. "People know we're here. People know what we've discovered." Calloway laughed softly. "Do they? A hired gun and a rancher's daughter, both with reputations for impulsiveness? I think not. Now, shall we conclude this unpleasant business?" He nodded to his men, who moved to seize Lillian. In that instant, Weston surged upward, tackling the nearest gunman around the knees. Lillian fired at the second man, her bullet striking his shoulder and spinning him around. Chaos erupted in the small church. Calloway retreated behind a pew as his men grappled with Weston. Lillian tried to aim at Calloway, but the wounded gunman lunged at her, knocking her revolver aside. The gun discharged into the ceiling, sending splinters of wood raining down. Weston was fighting desperately against the other man, both of them crashing into pews and overturning a small table. Lillian struggled with her attacker, kicking and striking with all her strength. She managed to break free just as the church door burst open. "What in heaven's name?" a voice thundered. Everyone froze. In the doorway stood a broad-shouldered man wearing a marshal's badge, flanked by two deputies with shotguns. "Marshal Davis," Calloway recovered first, straightening his coat. "Thank goodness you've arrived. These two broke in, attempted to rob me during my morning prayers." "That's a lie," Lillian exclaimed. "This man has been stealing cattle across the territory. He's behind the rustling operations at Lancaster's ranch." Marshal Davis surveyed the scene, his weathered face unreadable. "Mr. Calloway, unusual to find you in Blackfoot." "Business brings me to many places, Marshal," Calloway replied smoothly. "Now, if you would be so kind as to arrest these criminals." "That would be difficult," a new voice said from behind the marshal. An elderly man stepped forward, leaning heavily on a cane. "Seeing as one of them is operating under my authority." "Judge Harmon," Lillian breathed, recognition dawning. "I thought you were in boys," Calloway said sharply, his composure slipping for the first time. "I was meant to be," the judge agreed, "but received an urgent telegram from the Cattlemen's Association in Pocatello, something about stolen cattle and a man named Calloway." His keen eyes fixed on Weston. "You must be Hayes. They said you'd be bringing evidence." "Yes, Your Honor," Weston said, wiping blood from his face. "Miss Patterson can identify cattle stolen from her family's ranch, currently being held and rebranded at Charles Lancaster's property." Judge Harmon nodded. "Marshal, I believe we have sufficient cause to investigate these allegations. Please secure Mr. Calloway and his associates." "This is outrageous," Calloway blustered. "I am a businessman with connections in Washington. You can't possibly—" "I can and I will," Judge Harmon interrupted coldly. "Marshal, please escort Mr. Calloway to your office. I will hear statements from all parties before determining how to proceed." As the deputies moved to take Calloway and his men into custody, Lillian rushed to Weston's side. "You're hurt," she said, examining the cut above his eye and the bruising already forming on his jaw. "I've had worse," he assured her, though he winced as she touched his face. "How did the marshal and judge know to come here?" "I believe I can answer that," said another voice. A man stepped into the church, tall, lean, with the unmistakable bearing of a lawman, though he wore no badge. "Tim Rawlins, Pinkerton Detective Agency." Been tracking Calloway for 6 months on behalf of the Northern Pacific Railroad. Pinkerton, Weston repeated, surprised. Rawlins nodded. Calloway's been buying land along the proposed railway route using insider information stolen from company offices. Northern Pacific hired us to find the leak and stop the land grab. He smiled slightly. Your activities at Lancaster's ranch provided the final evidence we needed. When you two disappeared from Twin Falls, I tracked you here, alerted Judge Harmon. So it wasn't coincidence the judge was still in town, Lillian said, understanding dawning. Hardly, Judge Harmon confirmed, approaching them. Mr. Rawlins reached me just as I was boarding the stage for boys. His information, combined with reports from the Cattlemen's Association, warranted immediate action. He studied Lillian with interest. You must be Thomas Patterson's daughter. Your father's a good man. Known him for years. Thank you, Your Honor, Lillian replied. He'll be relieved to know this matter is being addressed. It will take more than addressing, the judge said seriously. I'll need your formal statements, and you'll likely be required to testify when Calloway and Lancaster are brought to trial. We'll do whatever is necessary, Weston assured him. As Calloway was led away, his face a mask of cold fury, Lillian felt the tension of the past days begin to ease. They weren't safe, yet men like Calloway had long reaches even from jail, but they had powerful allies now. You should both come to the doctor's office, Marshal Davis suggested, eyeing Weston's injuries. Get cleaned up before giving your statements. They followed the marshal out of the church into the bright morning sunlight. The town of Blackfoot continued its daily business, largely unaware of the drama that had unfolded in the small church. At the doctor's office, Weston submitted to treatment with poor grace, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. The doctor cleaned and stitched the cut above his eye, wrapped his bruised ribs, and declared him lucky to have escaped more serious injury. Lillian waited nearby, removing her hat at last and allowing her red hair to fall freely around her shoulders. When the doctor finished with Weston, she moved to his side. Thank you, she said quietly. You could have been killed because of me. Weston looked up at her, his expression softening. Because of Calloway, he corrected, and I'd do it again. Something in the way he said it made Lillian's heart beat faster. Before she could respond, Judge Harmon entered, accompanied by a clerk prepared to take their statements. The next hours passed in a flurry of activity. They provided detailed accounts of everything they had witnessed, from the altered brands on Patterson cattle to Calloway's confession in the church. The judge listened attentively, asking occasional clarifying questions. This will be sufficient to hold Calloway and issue warrants for Lancaster and his men, Judge Harmon concluded. Marshal Davis has already dispatched deputies to Lancaster's ranch to secure the evidence and arrest any participants in the rustling operation. What about my father's cattle? Lillian asked. Once properly identified, they will be returned to your ranch, the judge assured her, though I fear some may already have been sold on. The Cattlemen's Association will compensate any losses, Rawlins interjected. Northern Pacific as well, given Calloway's connection to the land grab scheme. Relief washed over Lillian. Her mission had succeeded beyond what she had dared hope. Her father's ranch was safe, and the men responsible for threatening it would face justice. You should send a telegram to your father, Weston suggested. Let him know you're safe and what's happened. Yes, Lillian agreed, though I should probably leave out the part about being held at gunpoint in a church. Weston smiled, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his stitches. Probably wise. Judge Harmon cleared his throat. Miss Patterson, Mr. Hayes, I cannot overstate the value of your courage in this matter. Many have suffered from Calloway's schemes, and few have dared stand against him. You have done a great service to the territory. They accepted his praise with humble thanks, both too exhausted for more elaborate responses. The judge departed to prepare the necessary legal documents, leaving them alone in the marshal's office. "What will you do now?" Lillian asked, studying Weston's battered face. "Report back to the Cattlemen's Association," he replied. "Let them know the job's done." He hesitated, then added, "After that, I'm not sure. Might be time for a change." "What kind of change?" "The kind that doesn't involve getting shot at quite so often," Weston said with a wry smile. "Maybe find some land, raise a few cattle of my own. Been saving toward it for years." Lillian nodded, trying to ignore the strange disappointment his words evoked. Of course he would want to settle down eventually. Men like Weston Hayes didn't remain hired guns forever. "And you?" he asked. "Back to the Patterson ranch." "Yes," she said. "My father needs me, especially now." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with things unsaid. After all they had been through together, the thought of simply parting ways felt wrong, yet neither seemed able to suggest an alternative. The moment was broken by Marshal Davis's return. "Telegraph operator says the line to Boys is down," he informed Lillian. "Storm damaged it yesterday. Won't be fixed until tomorrow at earliest." Lillian sighed. "My father will be worried sick." "Might be faster to ride there yourself," Weston suggested. "It's 3 days from here?" "2 if I push hard," Lillian confirmed. "Not alone, you won't," Marshal Davis said firmly. "Calloway might be in custody, but his associates are still out there. I can't spare deputies to escort you." "I'll take her," Weston said, the decision appearing to surprise even himself. "I need to head that way regardless." Marshal Davis looked between them, then nodded. "That would ease my mind considerably, but not until tomorrow. Hayes, you need rest after those knocks you took." Despite her impatience to return home, Lillian couldn't argue with the marshal's assessment. Weston could barely stand without wincing, and their horses needed proper rest after the hard journey from Twin Falls. They took rooms at the small hotel in Blackfoot, both collapsing into exhausted sleep almost immediately. Lillian woke late in the afternoon, disoriented at first by the unfamiliar surroundings and the luxury of a real bed after days on the trail. After washing and changing into the cleanest of her trail-worn clothes, she went downstairs to find Weston already in the hotel's small dining room, looking remarkably improved after rest, despite the colorful bruising on his face. Marshal Davis came by, he informed her as she joined him. "Lancaster's been arrested along with 6 of his men. They found 28 cattle with altered brands, including 15 bearing the Patterson mark." "Only 15, Lillian frowned. "There were more than 20 stolen." "The others were likely moved already," Weston said gently. "But as the Pinkerton man said, you'll be compensated for the loss." Lillian nodded, though it wasn't truly about the money. Each of those cattle represented her father's careful breeding program, animals selected for specific traits that couldn't simply be replaced with cash. "The good news," Weston continued, "is that Judge Harmon has issued a formal protection order for your father's ranch. No one can approach or threaten the property while the case against Calloway proceeds." This, at least, was a relief. Her father and sisters would be safe from immediate reprisals. They ate a simple meal, both still adapting to the strange feeling of safety after days of constant vigilance. As they finished, Weston reached across the table, his hand coming to rest near hers without quite touching it. "Lillian," he said, using her first name for only the second time. "I've been thinking." "A dangerous pastime," she replied lightly, though her heart had begun to race. "Maybe so," he agreed with a small smile, "but I've been doing it anyway, about the future, about what happens after we reach Boys." Lillian met his gaze steadily, though she could feel heat rising in her cheeks. "And what conclusions have you reached, Mr. Hayes?" "That I don't want to say goodbye at your father's gate," he said simply. "That these past days, dangerous as they've been, have shown me something I've been missing all these years of drifting." "And what's that?" Lillian asked softly. "A purpose beyond the next job, a reason to build something lasting." His eyes held hers. "Someone worth staying in one place for." The directness of his words stole Lillian's breath. In the wild territories, courtship was often a practical affair, with little room for the elaborate rituals of Eastern society. Yet she had never expected such plain speaking, nor the effect it would have on her heart. "We've known each other less than a week," she reminded him, though even to her own ears the objection sounded weak. "I've known men for years without truly knowing them at all," Weston countered. "And I've known you for days that have shown me your courage, your determination, your loyalty, and your heart more clearly than years of peaceful acquaintance might have done." Lillian couldn't deny the truth of his words. The dangers they had faced together had stripped away the pretenses that normally characterized initial meetings between men and women. There had been no time for artificial manners or false impressions. "What exactly are you proposing, Weston?" she asked, deliberately using his first name. "That when we reach your father's ranch, you introduce me not just as the man who helped recover your cattle, but as a man who wishes to court you properly," he said. "If you're amenable." A smile spread across Lillian's face, warming her eyes. "I believe I might be amenable to such an introduction," she said. "Though I should warn you, my father is rather protective of his daughters." "As he should be," Weston replied seriously. "I wouldn't respect him if he weren't. And my sisters will likely subject you to relentless questioning about your intentions and history." "I look forward to meeting the women who taught you to be so formidable," Weston said with a grin. "Though I might wear extra padding for the encounter, in case frying pans are involved." Lillian laughed, the sound bright in the quiet dining room. "A wise precaution. Margaret has excellent aim." The evening passed in comfortable conversation, their previous awkwardness replaced by a newfound ease. They made plans for the journey to Boise, discussing routes and potential hazards with the familiarity of long-time traveling companions. The following morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for traveling. Their horses, well rested and fed, seemed eager for the trail as they set out from Blackfoot. Marshal Davis and Judge Harmon saw them off, with final reminders about the upcoming legal proceedings against Calloway and Lancaster. "We'll send word when you're needed to testify," the judge assured them. "Should be within a month or two." The journey to Boise was remarkably uneventful compared to their previous adventures. They rode at a steady pace, no longer fleeing pursuit but still cautious enough to avoid the main roads. The countryside was beautiful in the early autumn, with trees beginning to turn gold and crimson against the blue Idaho sky. They made camp each night beneath the stars, sharing stories and gradually filling in the blank spaces in their knowledge of each other. Lillian told Weston about growing up on the ranch, about her sister's distinct personalities, about her mother's early death and her father's determination to raise 3 daughters who could thrive in the harsh territory. Weston spoke of his time in the war, of the nightmares that still sometimes woke him, of his years drifting from job to job before finding purpose with the Cattlemen's Association. He told her of his dream to have his own small ranch someday, a place where he could build something lasting. "There's land available near your father's ranch," he mentioned on their final night before reaching Boise. "Nothing grand, but good water access and enough acreage for a modest herd." "I know the plot you mean," Lillian said, stoking the small campfire. "The old Everett place." It's been vacant for nearly 2 years since Jeremiah Everett moved back east to care for his ailing mother. Would be convenient, Weston said casually, for courting purposes. Lillian smiled across the fire at him. Very practical of you. I'm a practical man, he agreed, his eyes reflecting the flames, with admittedly impractical feelings. The heat that rose to Lillian's cheeks had nothing to do with the fire. Weston Hayes, are you attempting to be romantic? Attempting, he admitted with a self-deprecating smile. Not sure I'm succeeding. You're doing better than you might think, Lillian assured him softly. Late the following afternoon, they crested the final hill that overlooked the Patterson ranch. The main house sat proudly amid a cluster of outbuildings, with corrals and barns arranged in a practical layout. Fields stretched beyond, and in the distance, cattle grazed on the autumn golden grass. Home, Lillian said, a wealth of emotion in the simple word. Weston studied the ranch with appreciative eyes. Your father built something fine here. Yes, Lillian agreed proudly, and worth fighting for. They rode down to the ranch yard where their arrival caused immediate commotion. A tall, silver-haired man emerged from the main house, leaning heavily on a cane but moving with determination toward them. Pa, Lillian called, dismounting quickly and rushing to embrace her father. Thomas Patterson held his daughter tightly, relief evident in every line of his weathered face. Lillian, he said gruffly, you had us worried sick, girl. No word for days, then a telegraph from Twin Falls saying you disappeared. I'm sorry, Pa, Lillian said contritely. There's so much to tell you. But first, she turned to where Weston had dismounted, standing respectfully to one side. This is Weston Hayes. He works for the Cattlemen's Association, and he's the reason I'm standing here safely. Thomas Patterson studied Weston with shrewd eyes that missed nothing, not the healing cut above his eye, nor the careful way he held himself to protect bruised ribs, nor the quality of his well-worn but well-maintained gear. Mr. Hayes, Patterson said, extending his hand. Seems I owe you a debt of gratitude. No debt, sir, Weston replied, shaking the offered hand firmly. Your daughter is quite capable of taking care of herself. I merely provided company along the way. And modest, too, Patterson observed wryly. Well, come inside, both of you. The girls will want to see their sister, and you can tell me this story properly. Inside the spacious ranch house, Lillian was engulfed by her sisters Cordelia, tall and practical like their father, and Margaret, petite and quick-witted. Both regarded Weston with undisguised curiosity as introductions were made. Over a hearty meal prepared by Cordelia, Lillian and Weston took turns relating their adventure, from their meeting in the Twin Falls saloon to the capture of Cowboy in the Blackfoot church. Thomas Patterson listened with growing anger at the scheme that had targeted his ranch, and with evident pride in his daughter's role in bringing it to an end. So Judge Harmon believes our cattle will be returned, he asked when they had finished. The ones they still had at Lancaster's ranch, yes, Lillian confirmed. The others? Well, the Cattlemen's Association and Northern Pacific have promised compensation. Patterson nodded thoughtfully. Money doesn't replace good breeding stock, but it's better than nothing. He turned his attention to Weston. And you, Mr. Hayes, what brings you to my home beyond escorting my daughter? The directness of the question might have flustered a lesser man, but Weston met Patterson's gaze steadily. Sir, during our journey, I've come to admire your daughter greatly, he said plainly. Her courage, her intelligence, her determination. With your permission, I'd like to court her properly. A stunned silence fell over the table. Margaret's eyes widened, while Cordelia looked between Lillian and Weston with sudden understanding. Thomas Patterson leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Is this what you want, Lily? he asked his daughter, using the childhood nickname that rarely emerged these days. Lillian's cheeks were flushed, but her voice was steady. "Yes, Pa, it is." Patterson studied Weston for a long moment. "You have a place of your own, Hayes, or are you still riding for the Cattlemen's Association?" "I've saved enough to purchase land," Weston replied. "Was considering the old Everett place not far from here." "Good land," Patterson acknowledged. "Needs work, but good bones to it." "I'm not afraid of work, sir." Patterson nodded slowly. "So I gather. Well, Mr. Hayes, I won't stand in the way of my daughter's choice. She's proven capable of making sound decisions, even under fire." His stern expression softened slightly. "But I'd like to know the man who'd court my Lily a bit better before you settle anything permanent." "That's all I ask, sir," Weston said, relief evident in his voice. "The chance to prove my worth." "You've already begun to do that by bringing her home safely," Patterson replied. He rose from the table, wincing slightly at the movement. "Now, if you'll excuse me, these old bones need rest. Cordelia will show you to the guest room, Hayes. I expect you'll stay a few days before looking at the Everett place, if that's acceptable, sir." "It is." Patterson moved to the door, then paused. "One thing, Hayes. That red hair of hers didn't scare you off like it has half the eligible men in the territory." Weston smiled, his eyes finding Lillian's across the table. "No, sir. When I first saw her, someone called her trouble because of it." "And what did you say to that?" Patterson asked, clearly already knowing the answer from their earlier story but wanting to hear it again. "I said, 'Good, I like a little fire,'" Weston replied honestly. "Still do," Patterson chuckled. "You'll need it, riding the trail with a Patterson woman." With that, he left the room, his cane thumping softly on the wooden floor. After Patterson's departure, Cordelia and Margaret subjected Weston to a thorough but good-natured interrogation about his background, his intentions, and his ability to handle their headstrong sister. He answered with patience and humor, earning reluctant approval from both women. Later that evening, Lillian and Weston found themselves alone on the front porch, watching as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear. "Your family is everything you described," Weston said, leaning against the porch railing. "Formidable." "They like you," Lillian assured him, standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Even Pa, though he'd never admit it so quickly." "I'm glad," Weston replied softly, "because I meant what I said about courting you properly." Lillian turned to face him, her fiery hair catching the golden light spilling from the house windows. "And I meant it when I said I wanted that," she said. "Though I warn you, proper courting in this family involves fence mending, cattle branding, and occasional gunfights with rustlers." Weston laughed, the sound rich in the evening quiet. "I wouldn't have it any other way." He reached out, hesitantly touching a strand of her hair that the breeze had lifted. "Fire indeed," he murmured. Lillian smiled, leaning slightly closer. "Does it still not scare you?" "On the contrary," Weston replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It terrifies me completely, but some things are worth facing fear for." In the soft glow of twilight, with the ranch house behind them and the vast Idaho sky above, Weston Hayes kissed Lillian Patterson for the first time. It was a gentle kiss, respectful of their new understanding, yet filled with promise of deeper feelings to come. When they parted, Lillian's green eyes were bright with emotion. "I think," she said softly, "that this is the beginning of a very interesting journey, Mr. Hayes." "One I look forward to taking with you, Miss Patterson," he replied. "Every step of the way." The days that followed took on a rhythm that felt at once new and somehow familiar. Weston integrated himself into the daily life of the Patterson ranch, helping with repairs, joining the hands on short rides to check the remaining cattle, and gradually earning the respect of Thomas Patterson as the older man observed his work ethic and character. 2 weeks after their arrival, the promised cattle were returned from Lancaster's ranch, driven by Marshal Davis's deputies. The Patterson family celebrated their return with a special dinner to which the neighboring ranchers were invited, a clear statement that the Pattersons remained strong despite Calloway's attempts to break them. During this gathering, Weston was formally introduced as a new neighbor, having purchased the Everett property with Thomas Patterson's assistance and advice. The news was met with curiosity and some speculation, especially when observers noted the way Weston and Lillian gravitated toward each other throughout the evening. Autumn deepened into winter, bringing snow to the Idaho mountains and quiet evenings when the Patterson family gathered around the fireplace. Weston split his time between establishing his new ranch and courting Lillian, riding the 3 miles between properties almost daily regardless of weather. By spring, the transformation was complete. Weston Hayes, once a drifting hired gun, had become a respected rancher with promising prospects. The Everett place, now the Hayes Ranch, was taking shape under his careful stewardship, with repaired fences, a freshly painted house, and the nucleus of a small but quality herd. In April, Calloway and Lancaster stood trial in boys. Lillian and Weston testified to what they had witnessed, their testimony corroborated by evidence gathered from Lancaster's ranch and by Pinkerton agent Rawlins's extensive investigation. The verdict was swift guilty on all counts. Calloway was sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, Lancaster to 8. As they left the courthouse after the sentencing, Weston took Lillian's hand. "It's over," he said simply. "Truly over. Justice done," Lillian agreed, squeezing his hand. "Though I doubt Calloway will serve his full sentence. Men like him have ways of shortening their time. By then, he'll be old news," Weston replied confidently. "The railroad is coming through officially now, following the proper routes with fair compensation to landowners. His scheme is finished." They walked through Boyes's bustling streets toward the hotel where they were staying during the trial. The city was growing rapidly, with new construction visible on nearly every block. "I've been thinking," Weston said as they paused to let a wagon pass. "Now that the trial is over and spring roundup is complete." "Yes," Lillian prompted when he hesitated. "It might be time to speak with your father about more permanent arrangements," Weston finished, his normally confident voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. Lillian's heart raced, though she kept her expression composed. "What sort of permanent arrangements did you have in mind, Mr. Hayes?" Weston stopped walking, turning to face her fully. In the middle of Boyes's Main Street, with passers-by flowing around them like a river around stones, he took both her hands in his. "Marriage, Miss Patterson," he said directly. "If you'll have me." Despite having anticipated this moment for months, Lillian found herself momentarily speechless. The man before her, once a stranger who had stood beside her against impossible odds, had become essential to her happiness in ways she had never imagined possible. "I believe," she finally managed, her voice steadier than she felt, "that would be acceptable." A slow smile spread across Weston's face. "Just acceptable. Perhaps a bit more than acceptable," Lillian admitted, her own smile matching his. "Perhaps entirely desirable." Ignoring the curious glances of Boyes's citizens, Weston Hayes kissed Lillian Patterson in broad daylight, sealing their agreement with a thoroughness that left her breathless and laughing. "I take it that's a yes?" he asked when they finally parted. "Yes," Lillian confirmed. "Though you'll still need to ask my father formally." "I wouldn't dream of skipping that step," Weston assured her. "I value my life too highly." They returned to the Patterson ranch the following day, where Weston promptly requested a private meeting with Thomas Patterson. The older man, who had been expecting this conversation for some time, maintained a stern facade throughout Weston's formal request for Lillian's hand, before finally allowing a smile to break through. "You've proven yourself a good man, Hayes," Patterson said, extending his hand. "And more importantly, you make my Lily happy. You have my blessing." The wedding took place in June of 1879, a joyous affair that brought together ranching families from across the territory. The ceremony was held on Patterson land, beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak tree that Lillian's mother had loved. Cordelia stood as her sister's maid of honor, while Margaret decorated the ranch with wildflowers gathered from the surrounding hills. Lillian wore a dress of pale green that complemented her eyes and enhanced the vivid copper of her hair, which she wore loose and flowing in defiance of conventional bridal styles. Weston, cleaned up and uncomfortable in a new suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him on her father's arm. Judge Harmon, who had become a friend to both families, performed the ceremony with dignified warmth. When Weston placed the simple gold band on Lillian's finger, his hands were steady, but his voice trembled slightly with emotion as he repeated his vows. "I, Weston Hayes, take you, Lillian Patterson, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." Lillian's clear voice carried across the assembled guests as she made the same promise, her green eyes never leaving Weston's face. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Harmon declared. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Hayes." Weston needed no further invitation, gathering Lillian into his arms for a kiss that started respectfully, but quickly became more demonstrative than was strictly proper, earning cheers and good-natured laughter from the guests. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed an army. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit throughout the ranch yard, casting a golden glow over the festivities. Weston and Lillian moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes from friends and neighbors. Late in the evening, Thomas Patterson called for attention, raising his glass in a toast to the newlyweds. "To my daughter Lillian," he began, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet gathering, "whose fire and determination have always been her greatest strengths, no matter what others might have called them." His eyes twinkled as he looked at Weston. "And to my new son, who had the good sense to recognize that fire for what it is, not trouble, but the spark of a spirit that will warm his life for all his days." "To Lillian and Weston," the guests responded, raising their glasses. As the celebration wound down, the couple prepared to depart for their new home, the Hayes Ranch, which would now truly become their shared domain. Amidst hugs, handshakes, and a few happy tears, they mounted their horses for the short ride home. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet Idaho sky. They rode at a leisurely pace, savoring these first moments of married life. "Happy, Mrs. Hayes?" Weston asked, glancing at his bride. Lillian's smile was answer enough, but she replied anyway. "Entirely, Mr. Hayes. Though it will take some getting used to the name, I mean. You'll always be Trouble to me," he teased gently. "My beautiful, fiery Trouble," Lillian laughed, the sound bright in the night air. "And you, Weston Hayes, will always be the man who wasn't scared away by a little fire." "Best decision I ever made," he said simply. They continued toward their home beneath the stars, two people who had found in each other not just love, but partnership, understanding, and the promise of a future built together, one day at a time. That future unfolded over the years with all the richness and complexity that life on the Idaho frontier demanded. The Hayes Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, expanding gradually as they acquired additional acreage and built up their herd with careful breeding. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Lillian's father, arrived in the spring of 1880, bringing new joy and challenges. He inherited his mother's red hair and his father's steady temperament, growing into a thoughtful boy who loved the land as much as his parents did. 2 years later, twins Eliza and James joined the family, completing their household with double the laughter and mischief. Eliza had her father's dark hair but her mother's fiery spirit, while James combined Lillian's copper locks with Weston's quiet strength. Through all the seasons of their marriage, the prosperous years and the lean ones, the joys of watching their children grow, and the sorrows of eventually burying Lillian's father, the bond forged during those dangerous days in 1878 remained unbroken. The fire that had drawn them together continued to burn steadily, warming their home and lighting their way forward. In later years, when their children asked how they had met, Weston would always begin the story the same way. "Your mother's red hair made them call her Trouble. But I took one look at her and said, 'Good, I like a little fire.'" And Lillian would smile, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing, knowing that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the courage to embrace a little trouble and the wisdom to recognize the perfect partner for the journey ahead.